Thank you everyone for attending my talk today. So this work was done by myself with my two colleagues, Graham Johnson and Jacques Ophoff. And we're going to be talking a little bit about shining a light on the problems that dyslexics have with passwords. Now, because this is a presentation about dyslexia, I've chosen to use a dyslexic-friendly font throughout my presentation. And this is a free font that's available on the web, and it's been proven to be the most helpful font for dyslexics so that they can it makes reading a lot easier for them. If you're interested in it, you can go download it. I have done so. So everything started in 1961 with Fernando Corbato. He came up with a system that allowed multiple users to work on it, and he quickly discovered that people needed personal accounts because they had private files. And so he came up with the password. And that was fine because the people he was dealing with were technologically competent, and they only had one password to remember. And so the password didn't cause any problems at all. However, the password started to cause problems as more and more of us started to use them. Now, this was a seminal paper published by Anne Adams and Angela Zasse, who said that users are not the enemy. And this was one of the first studies of password usage within an organization. And they really highlighted this tension between security and usability, which Joachim spoke about so eloquently in the previous talk. Today, apparently, we have an average of 191 passwords, and the human brain was not designed to be able to cope with this number of passwords, and therefore you see all sorts of coping behaviors. But we're not talking about coping behaviors today. What we're talking about is something else which is equally important. So governments and businesses across the globe are moving their services online. And in the EU and the UK specifically, such services are required by law to be accessible to all citizens. Now, accessibility is often, when they are concerned about websites, they are concerned about blind people. And this is a lady who actually sued websites because they were not accessible to her as a blind user. I know the Olympics, some years ago, the Olympics website was sued as well successfully for not being accessible to blind people. But there are also other accessibility issues, one of which we're going to highlight today. We believe that while the security and usability tension is indeed valid, there's another dimension which we hope to highlight today, which is indeed accessibility. And that this also creates a whole new dimension of tension between accessibility and security, and accessibility and usability. The International Dyslexia Organization defines dyslexia as a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin, and it is characterized by problems with spelling and decoding particular words. So they can then know a word, but they may not be able to translate that word into the actual characters that are needed to write it. They have word processing difficulties. They struggle to retain words. They often use synonyms of a word because the word is mapped to the same meaning in their minds. Lots of spelling issues and variable spelling. This is a real problem where most of us will make the same spelling mistake every time we use a word. If we don't spell it correctly, the spelling for a dyslexic person will change from day to day. And sequencing is a huge problem. Some people believe that 1 in 5 have dyslexia. Other people estimate it as 1 in 10, but it's still a very high number of people in our society. Now, in fact, these are famous dyslexics, and you can see that dyslexia has nothing to do with intelligence. It is just that the brain works differently, which makes reading difficult. But these are very, very creative people. They are very right brain oriented, and they make massive strides in very many domains. They are empathetic. They do suffer, especially at school, because they can't do the things that other kids find really easy to do. They think in pictures, and they're very creative people. And they are treated a lot of the time as if they are stupid, less today than, say, 40 years ago. So if you look at the top right picture, this is how a dyslexic person may spell the same word on different days of the week. Some dyslexics have described what the top left is how text looks for them when they're trying to read. It's not the way we see it, non-dyslexics. And so they have a lot of difficulty with reading, but also specifically with writing and spelling. And so to bring us to passwords, passwords are essentially words. They're alphanumeric strings. And so if you can think about the fact that for a dyslexic, creating these passwords, remembering them, and then being able to enter them correctly every time is going to cause huge issues for them. And so, for example, if the password is belladonna, on different days of the week, they may spell it with 2 Ds or with a B and a B, or even insert an I somewhere, or not do a double L. And remember the fact that when you type your password and you get 0 feedback, because passwords are obfuscated, and therefore that hurts them even more. And you can't, they tend to use spell checkers a lot in other walks of life, but clearly that's not going to help in the password context. And it's not just passwords, those codes that the British Rail sends you when you buy a ticket online and you have to enter it. That's very difficult for a dyslexic. And the code that PayPal sends me, that would be hard for a dyslexic to do in the correct order as well. So this kind of difficulty seems not really to have been noticed. So we did a literature review. We searched extensively across anywhere we could find using the words dyslexia or dyslexic and passwords. And I'm going to quickly go through what we discovered. We discovered first that there were quite a few papers about searching using the web to search for things. And of course, they have made great strides in this area. The next one really is in understanding dyslexia. The next one is in dyslexia in education and how dyslexics can better be supported, which, as I say, they're doing a lot better these days. Then we have accessibility, which was the one that really struck us when we were looking at this issue. And the final one is how we can ameliorate it. And I'll just go into a little bit more detail in each of these areas. But before I do, I can just mention that in all the papers we found, there were only 3 that specifically mentioned any impact of dyslexia on passwords. The first paper was by Subashini and Sumitra, where they specifically addressed disabilities and passwords, and they included dyslexia as well as disabilities like blindness or visual difficulties. Helkala looked as well at some of the inherent issues in recalling and misspelling. And finally, Gibson et al. Came up with a musical password, which was a very attractive option for dyslexics. They mentioned it in their paper, but they didn't test it with dyslexics. And so if we look at the dyslexia research, the educational research is really basically the impact, and we were specifically looking for password-related stuff, and there we discovered that there was some mention of people trying to learn how to code. The next one really was, as I said, the searching, when you use a search engine like Google, how that accommodates variable spelling, which I think has probably been more successful than many other areas. Then we have there are a lot of people talking about the challenges of the guidelines. And so here we get accessibility, looking at guidelines for making things accessible and web accessibility in general, but only one paper that talks actually about the challenges of passwords and accessibility, which was the Subashini paper. And then there's the understanding part, and this is really about people trying to figure out why dyslexics struggle so much. What is it in the brain that makes reading and spelling and those sorts of things difficult? None of that was particularly helpful when it came to passwords. And then we had a lot of people coming up with ameliorations. And this was the one paper we found where they'd come up with a password alternative, but they hadn't specifically tested with dyslexics. They just mentioned that this would be likely to be helpful to dyslexics. They were mostly testing it with elderly people. So I'll put everything together. I believe there were 32 papers, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe one of my co-authors can correct me if I've got that wrong, but definitely in the 30s. Not a lot of papers if you think about the amount of number of dyslexics that are really struggling. And I'm sorry, I think my animations went a bit wrong here. So password strength requirements are particularly problematical because it's not even just a word now. People have to remember where the special character goes, and numbers and all that sort of thing. As I mentioned earlier, when people are doing 2-factor authentication where the code is being sent and they have to write that in, that's probably going to stump them. because they probably get the sequence wrong and eventually get locked out of the account. And as we really improve authentication strength, we impact accessibility as well as usability. It's not just improving strength and losing usability. So to go back to the original diagram, we cannot ignore accessibility because it's a legal requirement, but it's not something that we believe has been incorporated very much into authentication design so far. Now, I was very happy to be able to listen to Eugene Spafford's talk, and some of the things really resonated with me. He said, why do we use the same tool everywhere and maximize speed of development, minimize cost? And I have added, well, we don't think, right? We just slap on a password and go, well, this is what people can do. We don't really think about how it's going to impact a large sector of society who struggle with spelling and with language and text. Spafford also said, why don't we look at the overall context and think about what quality really means? And of course, my addition to that is, again, why don't we stop reaching for the password as if it's the only and the best tool for the job? And so basically, you know, if authentication is unusable, the mechanism is unsound. If it's inaccessible, we're breaking the law. But if it's unusable and inaccessible, it fails as a security mechanism. You cannot say it's okay, the password's really strong, because if people can't use it, it's not going to give you a strong authentication mechanism. So we've thought of a number of research directions, given that all we've done really is taken a snapshot of the entire field. Dyslexics are clearly using passwords, but we couldn't find any investigation really that looked at, actually had interviewed them to ask them about how they actually cope, because we need to know that before we can try to help them. Password managers are clearly a great way for dyslexics not to have to engage with passwords very much. We'd like to also look at that. And then also look at how can we make this multi-factor authentication more accessible, because asking people to enter a code that we provide them with is going to be problematical. Alternative authentication mechanisms, as I've said, Gibson et al. Looked at a musical password, which is very attractive. That work didn't really go anywhere after that excellent research, but you know, that kinds of things we should be looking at. We should be studying dyslexia specifically in the security context and not just looking at it in the context where we found most of our papers was based in education and in understanding why a dyslexia occurs. We're going to have to start looking at its impact on our computing related lives. And then basically, how do you speak to dyslexics? And how do you do research ethically with dyslexics? Because obviously they will have experienced a lot of harm in growing up, being different from other children, and you don't want to cause them even more anxiety when you speak to them about it. So on the right is Henry Winkler, who the older of us might remember as Fonzie. He was extremely dyslexic as a child, and he has written a range of books called about Hank Zipser, who is a dyslexic boy. He said so that children could realize that they weren't stupid and they were not alone in this, that there were many other people who struggled with it. And so just in concluding, accessibility is a legal requirement. It's not something we can ignore. It's a third dimension of looking at making authentication more human friendly. We cannot ignore our dyslexics. And I think as a field, we can do better now that we know that this problem exists. Now, since all three authors are based in Dundee, I've brought Desperate Dan in to ask if you have any questions. And thank you so much for your attention.